You are listening to MCC GeoPod, the geopolitical podcast of the Mátyás Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors and students, look up our knowledge base at Corvinak.hu/en.
So welcome everyone, this is Péter Heltai with the new episode of the MCC GeoPod, or Geopolitical Podcast Initiative. And today, in this very special episode, I'm joined by my co-host and colleague, Attila Demkó, head of the Center for Geopolitics at MCC. And I would like to welcome our distinguished guest, Gergely Salát, who is senior researcher at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and Trade and a well-known Chinese expert here in Hungary and Central Europe. Thank you very much again for accepting my invitation. So I think there are thousands of podcasts and complete channels reporting on China from a Western perspective, how Beijing expands its influence, mainly in the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. So we don't really want to compete with those channels, and we'll try to avoid here those cliches and really focus on the current strategic events and phenomena regarding China and, well, the so-called new Cold War. And this would be my first question to start off, that what do you think? Is there a new Cold War emerging or not?
I think there is. It is quite clear if you listen to what American politicians are saying, if you read either Chinese press or American press or Western journalists, you can feel that kind of déjà vu feeling that this has been here before. It really reminds me of the rhetoric of the 1950s. It's quite clear if you read the Western press. Maybe not 100% of the Western press, but the mainstream Western press, China is pictured as an empire of the evil. The Chinese press started to picture America as, and the whole Western world as declining, and saying that the time is working for China. And all in all, I think that if you say that there is now a new Cold War, then you're not very far from the truth. Of course, this is a different Cold War, like the Second World War was quite different from the First World War. Now the Second Cold War is different from the First Cold War, but still there are similarities between those.
I completely agree. In 2006, so it was like 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to visit in Shanghai the Institute of American Studies. And what the Chinese colleagues told us how they view the United States 15 years ago was very clear, that they saw the United States as a competitor, as a problematic country. And actually, when I left the building, I thought that the better name would be for the institute is the Institute of Anti-American Studies. They had a very negative opinion back in 2006. Yes, there is a Cold War, but it's a different Cold War. We have the three main players, or three players are the same: China, Russia, and the United States, but the roles are different. So during the Cold War, second half of the Cold War, China was a de facto ally of the United States. Now we see China and the United States playing the two main roles, and we have Russia, which can be or could be in the future the ally of China. So we have a different setup of the three major countries. In the 70s and 80s, we had United States against Soviet Union with the tacit support of China against the Soviet Union. And today we have China and Russia. Both of them are very much against the United States, and seemingly they do support each other.
I think it's also very important to understand, and maybe, Gergely, that's why you are here, to help us understand or get a better understanding of the Chinese foreign policy strategy. Could you give us a better understanding or explanation how differently Chinese foreign policy and foreign policy strategy operate?
Well, it is quite clear that the Chinese mindset is that China is a great power, or it should be a great power. They are not saying it clearly, but it is quite obvious that they want to play a global role. They want to be at least one of the great powers of the world, maybe the only great power. So that's the basis of the Chinese foreign policy. And second, I think China is focusing on its neighboring environment. So what goes on in Africa or in South America or in Central and Eastern Europe is not extremely important for China. China is not in the stage of being a real global power. China has only, I think, one naval base in a foreign country. What is now really important for China is securing its own environment and securing its core interest. You can see that there are some contradictions in Chinese foreign policy. On the one hand, it tries to picture itself as a cute panda who needs to be stroked and who is full of goodwill and just wants to be a friend of everyone. So it tries to enhance its soft power. But on the other hand, in the case of Taiwan, in the case of the South China Sea and Tibet and Xinjiang and whatever, they seem to be very aggressive, which is contradictory to that soft power effort of China. And the explanation for this is quite clear. China differentiates between core interest and other interest. And core interest is related to the questions of sovereignty, over, let's say, Taiwan and Tibet and the South China Sea and East China Sea, whatever. And in core interest, it does not compromise. It does not get into any kind of negotiations. China will not negotiate about where Hong Kong or Taiwan or Tibet or Xinjiang belongs, because it says that they all belong to the People's Republic of China, and they are not going to talk about that question. So about this core interest, China can be very aggressive, but in all other parts of the world and in all other areas, Chinese are ready to negotiate and to get into compromises. That's also part of the Chinese mindset. And I think that right now, even though China wants to be a great power, its priority is securing its own environment in the Asia-Pacific, in Southeast Asia, and other parts of the world are still not very important for it.
Maybe this brings us to Attila's article, which is one of the basis of this conversation. You wrote a piece on Corvinak, or MCC's digital outlet, about the Chinese-Russian relationship, the past, the present, and the future, basically, and some elements of it. And according to your analysis, back then in 2008, even before the Beijing Olympics, there happened something between Russia and China that was a strong message to Washington, for instance.
Surely it was a message. I don't know if it was a coincidence, but it was just a few days before the war in Georgia. So Russian invasion of Georgia happened just a few days after this agreement. On a small piece of territory, Russia is not the country which gives back territory usually to any country, so it was something to look at in itself. But if we look at what happened afterwards, the invasion of Georgia and what is happening since then between the two countries, it's definitely something we have to see as an important point in both Chinese-Russian and Western-Russian relations. So I think the Russians gave a warning to the West in 2007, the famous speech of Vladimir Putin in Munich. That was a very clear warning, not even one warning, at least 10 warnings were given and on different subjects to the face of John McCain, to the core of the Western Atlantic elite. And these warnings were unheeded. So the Bucharest Summit happened. And after that, we saw this agreement, and we have to see the Chinese mindset that they, even if being very huge and having the biggest population and the most dynamic economy, they still have a feeling of humiliation by the neighboring countries. And Russia, in a way, was one of the first countries to give them at least a symbolic gesture. That yes, we took Chinese imperial land. Russia took hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. So we are speaking about 100 or 200 square kilometers, which was given back. But still, it's something. So when we look at the Chinese, what they are doing, some of these issues are rather symbolic. Of course, Senkaku Islands has the importance, but it's also a symbolic issue because Japan also humiliated China as they see it. And basically all the others, because the issues with India and some other countries are issues with the British Empire. They are also coming from the 19th century, and I think it shows a very important process that both China and Russia, they are competitors. And I think for Russia, the Russians clearly know that they know very well that China is not a cute panda but a dragon. But still, the Russian bear now seems to be more happy with the dragon than with the American eagle. So that's something we have to watch. And if we want to analyze what happened, we have to go back to 2008 for sure.
Have we seen any other than political signaling and messaging?
Well, if you look at the last decade, it is quite clear that Putin and now Xi Jinping is giving gestures to the other guy every week or many times every year. I think this is all something like a mistake of the United States and of the United States political and strategic elite. We've been talking about the first Cold War when, if I remember where it was Henry Kissinger who said that in this triangle of China, Russia, and the United States, the interest of the United States is to build a better relationship with both of its rivals than they have with each other. And this was a very wise strategy which actually worked. But this new American elite that has been dominating Washington for the past few decades, it seems to have forgotten Henry Kissinger's wisdom, and now it tries to push together Russia and China. It tries to crash the two at the same time, but I don't think the United States now has the power to crash Russia and China at the same time now. So I think they made this mistake that they actually didn't leave choice for either China or Russia. They didn't present a choice for Russia. Okay, you can be with us or you can be with China, please choose. Nothing like that happened. Russia was actually forced to turn to China if it didn't want to remain alone. And China was also quite happy to see that Russia is getting close to it because militarily and in quite many other areas, China still might need Russia's help. So I think that of course, Chinese and Russian friendship is not a sincere friendship. They have a lot of problems. They may have a lot of conflicts, but on the basis of my enemy's enemy is my friend, the West, and especially the United States, just pushed them together. And now it seems to be a long-term phenomenon. So it's not like for practical reason, China is establishing good ties with Russia for a few years. It seems that this friendship or partnership or even alliance can last for decades as long as America treats both of them as its enemy.
The Chinese PR now in the world is somehow telling you that they are the more powerful in this game. That the dragon, as Attila called them, that the dragon is stronger than the Russian bear. Is this true in general? I'm asking this for two reasons. One, because I think maybe from a military perspective it's different, but in any other perspective, China now seems to be a much larger country that it would need necessarily in other aspects the help of Russia. What do you think about it in general? Who needs whom?
Well, I think Russia needs China more than China needs Russia, except for oil and gas and other natural resources, which China really needs and Russia is rich in. If you've been to China, you know that Chinese are very good in making you feel special, even though not only in international relations, but also in interpersonal relations. In China, the relations are usually hierarchical. There's someone who's the boss, someone who's down, someone who has more power, someone who has less power. Chinese families, Chinese companies, Chinese friendships are all hierarchical. There's always somebody who's the boss. And China is not saying it, but it's quite clear that it tries to build such kind of hierarchical relationships in the world as well. And it is, of course, now the aim of China to be the boss in all the hierarchical relationships. And of course, China is looking itself as the superior in its relationship to Russia. But still, it doesn't make Russia feel humiliated. It gives face to Russia. It gives face to Mr. Putin. So the Russian can feel that maybe China is richer than them, maybe China is more developed than them, but they are still giving it face. They still don't hurt its prestige, its pride. While the West is criticizing Russia all the time, and it tries to make it lose face all the time. So Chinese are, even though, of course, they feel themselves superior in this relationship, they still give Russia much more face and much more room for maneuver. So it's a more convenient partner. I mean, China is a much more convenient partner than the West.
Do you see it equally, Attila? I mean, do you agree with that elaboration, especially, and this would be the second part of my question, in terms of the military power of the two countries?
Yeah, first of all, let's start with the second question. Militarily, there are some aspects in which Russia is still stronger than China. So they can feel stronger, at least in nuclear forces. They are much stronger. And I think in certain technologies, the Russians are still better than the Chinese, especially fighter and bomber aircraft, because their engines, jet engines, are better than the Chinese engines, and the Chinese know that. So actually all the issues about buying engines or buying full airplanes, this is still an issue between the two countries, because Russia just don't want to sell only engines, and maybe the Russians don't want to sell their best technology yet. Well, if the current Western policy continues, I'm afraid that the Russians will sell everything to China, and this is a very problematic point. Because if you see, for example, what happened with Motor Sich, this is a Ukrainian company making helicopter engines. The Chinese cannot make this level of engines yet, and they wanted to buy it. The West stopped it. But the Russians now are able to make similar engines. But the fighter engines are even more important. So Chinese definitely have a problem with that, because this is a special technology. You cannot just copy it. You can reverse engineer almost everything, but this is such a high level of metallurgy that the Chinese are not yet there where the Russians are, and actually the Russians are not there yet where the Americans and the West is currently. So
I'm sorry, and this might be also a question of intelligence capacity.
No, I think it's such. These technologies are very, very, very sophisticated. You cannot so easily steal these technologies. So actually, you have to buy the whole process. You have to steal too many components just to copy it easily. But turning back to the other part of your question, so I think and I completely agree with Mr. Salát that the issue is that China is not humiliating Russia. Even if Chinese are entering Russian space, Russian sphere of interest, they are doing it more politely, and they are doing it in Central Asia. That's very clear that the Chinese are entering former or even current Russian sphere of interest. But what the West is saying, there is no such a thing as sphere of interest. So Ukraine should do what Ukraine wants to do, or Belarus or Georgia. But first of all, if we are very realistic about issues, you cannot say that there are no spheres of interest for great powers. It's not as simple as that. And secondly, it's not only in the case of Ukraine, it's not only sphere of interest for Russia. It's not only about military bases. It's not only about economy. It's about national pride. Ukraine's role in Russian history and Russian self-esteem is incomparable to the role of Central Asia in Russian self-esteem. And I don't know whose idea was Ukraine's invitation to NATO or accepting this process, but definitely if there is one point which can make the Russians mad, that to see a NATO flag in Kiev. So I think this was the worst, from a geopolitical, geostrategical moves, the worst move of the West, because this is exactly the anti-Kissinger scenario. This will help Russia to ally with China on the long term. And until this is not changed, then we will see a strengthening Russian-Chinese alliance, despite the fact that the Russians are fearing China too.
We have just arrived to NATO and the Americans. And by the time I think that this podcast will be published, the Biden administration has more than 100 days in power, and many prestigious magazines like the Foreign Policy, for instance, label the new foreign strategy of the US as America is back, that this would be the motto. I wanted to bring here a little saying which says that where Americans or where the US slams a door, the Chinese immediately appear to knock in. How do you see this? Is this true from a global or geopolitical perspective? We haven't even touched upon Africa and the global South, but this can be, I think, a very useful perspective which can, somehow shed a light on the future of the Second Cold War.
I don't think that what the Chinese is doing is always depending on what the US is doing. They are not waiting for the US to shut the doors. They are already there if it's their interest. West seems to see everything as a zero-sum game, like a Chinese presence or foreign presence in Africa or in Central and Eastern Europe and whatever. But this zero-sum mentality is not really what really characterizes Chinese thinking. And they are not in Africa to push back American interests. They are not in Southeast Asia to fight with the American influence. They are just there to make money. They are there to get profit. They are there maybe to gain some political influence, but they are not doing it for the sake of political influence. They are doing it for the sake of fueling their own economy. And I think that's the core of Chinese foreign politics, which I haven't mentioned before, that Chinese foreign politics, Chinese foreign policy is more domestic policy, domestic Chinese policy than foreign policy. They do everything for the stability of their regime. They do everything for the further development of their economy. They are not, right now at least, they are not thinking in terms of gaining more geopolitical influence or whatever. They are thinking of getting more oil for their economy. They are thinking of getting more market for their vaccines or whatever.
So what you're saying is basically that, for instance, the Belt and Road Initiative is a domestic project, or with domestic objectives.
Well, I think most of all it has a domestic objective. we can talk about it, but it's quite well discussed in international literature that there are a lot of domestic problems that the Belt and Road Initiative tries to solve. Of course, it has some geopolitical aspects and it has some other aspects, but basically, Belt and Road Initiative is for the development of the Chinese economy, and through the development of the Chinese economy is the securing the position of the Chinese Communist Party. So everything China is doing abroad is about regime security, regime stability at home. That's how you should look at it. And gaining influence in other countries and pushing the Americans out of those countries is not something that is closely related to economic development and regime security. So that's not their main goal right now. Of course, if there's an opportunity in the world that, America is not doing business with this country and they have good opportunities, then we will go there and make business. But it's not really because the Americans have left, it's because they want to make business.
Attila?
I completely agree that the Chinese are very rational on what they are doing. They are not as ideological as the Soviets were with their expansion in Africa. And they are, I would say that they are even less ideological than the West today. So they are not asking questions. They want to sell their products. They want to give work to their workers. That's why Chinese workers built everything everywhere. They want, of course, they want influence. But the Chinese mindset is I think, an extremely rational mindset. They know very well that even if they have influence in Venezuela, or if they have influence in Africa, until they built up a huge fleet, until they are not a global power, these let's say, bases are very easy to cut from China. So they are not going into these games. They do have a military base in Djibouti, on the Red Sea. China is not building a global base, global alliance yet. They are focusing on their neighborhood in building alliances. So, of course, they are focusing on Russia. They are focusing on Pakistan. They are focusing on making India making India dependent on them, with building dams on the rivers leading to India, with, let's say, having good relations with countries around India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. So they are building this. They are playing this game. But the other games in Europe or in Africa or in South America, I think these are more like let's do business games. But they do have the geopolitical games in their own region. And what I would add that yes, Chinese foreign policy is domestic politics, but it's domestic politics also to play for the Chinese masses, for the Chinese nationalism, Chinese pride. So that's one thing we have to understand, that this country is not a North Korea where the people have no voice. They do have voice. I've been in China many times, extensively talked to Chinese people. They do have their opinions. Of course, you have a more limited internet, a far more limited internet, far more limited opportunity to get the news. But still, these people have opinions, and these people are usually very patriotic and very proud of being Chinese. So when China is let's say, in a debate about the Senkaku Islands or the South China Sea, and you only think about geopolitics or about having oil near these islands or gas near these islands, then you are wrong. This is also about Chinese pride and the pride of the masses and the legitimacy of the Communist Party. If you would give up the Senkaku Islands, or if you give up the South China Sea, you would lose your legitimacy in the eyes of the people. So I think these are two different games. The Chinese people are not interested in Africa. The Chinese people are not interested in Europe. That's business. Or Venezuela. They are in Venezuela, for example. We don't talk about that much. But without China, I don't know where the Maduro regime would be today in Venezuela. And Russia also plays a role there. So yes, they are in many places, but for them, these core interests are also the interests, domestic interests, because of the legitimacy of the Communist Party that we can provide. We can raise the Chinese people to their rightful place, and the rightful place is world domination, as China was the dominant power for hundreds, if not thousands of years, at least the strongest power. You can compare the Roman Empire to China, you can compare some Indian state to China, but we have to be realistic about that in terms of length and in terms of power. Chinese states were really the strongest states historically in the last 2,000-3,000 years.
I would also like to clear one more quite common misunderstanding about Chinese influence operations. Everybody's talking about the bad Chinese trying to gain influence globally in Africa, in Europe, in South America, wherever. But all these reports about Chinese influence gaining operation picture China as the bad guy who is trying to force something on small, poor, little, innocent countries. But actually, the question of agency is much more complicated. In many cases, maybe not in all cases, but in many cases, it is actually those small countries who are inviting Chinese influence. So it's not like the Chinese go there and force these African countries or Central European countries or whatever countries to get Chinese credits to build Chinese, let's say, of railway lines or stadiums or hospitals or whatever. It's these small countries who actually ask China for this investment, who ask for Chinese credit, who ask for Chinese presence in their own home country. So picturing China as the bad guy is I think a misunderstanding of the situation. It's much more complicated. Chinese influence is growing around the world because many countries in the world want Chinese influence to be present in their countries. Of course, for some geopolitical reasons, namely counterweighting Western influence.
Gergely Salát and Attila Demkó, this was our podcast for today. Our time is up, unfortunately, but I thank you very much for your contribution. Again, Gergely Salát and Attila Demkó, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this MCC GeoPod episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors and students, check out our knowledge base at Corvinak.hu/en.